I just felt that the Holy Spirit was speaking to me and said, Lily, you have to deal with this. What we don't realize as believers is that the anxiety and the issues that stems from trauma interferes with your ability to truly be free as God wants you to be free. Because out of fear, you won't do certain things. And that fear stems from your trauma.
Everyone has a story to tell.
Stories of hardship, stories of hope,
stories of doubt, stories of faith.
But no matter the story,
these diverse experiences of military life
can all be found at the intersection of faith, family, and profession.
This is OCF Crosspoint.
Before I share my guest's amazing story with you, I just wanted to let you know that this episode is the penultimate episode before Season 2 ends. After the next episode, Crosspoint will be taking a break for a few months before coming back next spring with a new season. Now, I normally save this next part for the end of each episode, but I'll go ahead and say it now. If you have an idea for a guest, topic, or story that I should consider for a future episode of the show, send an email to podcast@ocfusa.org or to josh.jackson@ocfusa.org. A few of you already have done this over the course of Season 2, and I greatly appreciate it. My guest this episode is Major Liliane Delva, United States Army. Liliane was initially interviewed for an article on Christian mentoring that appeared in the spring 2021 issue of Command magazine. I had intended to follow up with her to have her unpack that story about mentoring in more detail, specifically some of the challenges that she faced during her time at West Point. However, during the course of our 2.5-hour interview, it became apparent that I should just toss my notes out the window. What Liliane had to share was so much better than anything I had planned to ask her about. In her story, Liliane talks about the significance of the 9/11 attacks on her Army career, how her parents immigrated from Haiti and made it a point to keep the family away from some of the voodoo practices they saw while living there. And she also talks about how trauma from a molestation as a child had a profound impact on her life, creating much fear and anxiety before she followed that gentle nudging from God to get help and healing. Okay, let's jump into my conversation with Major Liliane Delva as she shares her story of military life at the intersection of faith, family, and profession.
I'm currently a major that's assigned to the 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 82nd Airborne Division, stationed out of Fort Bragg. Have been in the military for quite a while. I enlisted in October of 2000 as a 17-year-old with my twin sister. We're part of a program called Delayed Entry Program, which is where you're 17 and the Army enlists you, but you don't go into basic training until much later. So we had to get our parents to sign off on our contract. And then I was in basic training during September 11, 2001. So that was, I think at the time, my sister was already in advanced individual training down in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And so this day is definitely a memorable day for myself because it really did plant in my mind what service meant and what Army service meant to this nation. And I am definitely an American citizen, but I also have family members who are naturalized, came to this country from the country of Haiti, which is part of the island nation of Hispaniola that shares island with the Dominican Republic. Originally Catholic, we were all Catholic. Catholicism is one of the predominant religions in Haiti. And so my parents were Catholic, came over to the United States. I'm one of 8 children, so very, very big family. And so my parents had 4 children in Haiti and 4 in the States. For me, in terms of placement, I am the 6th child. My twin sister being the 7th, and I have a little sister, Nancy, who was the 8th child. I'm the smallest. I'm considered the runt of the family. I was born premature. And so still the smallest one in the family. Kind of made fun of that. And so it was a running joke that I'll probably need a waiver to get into the Army because I was pretty close to needing a waiver to get in. But I think I grew about an inch right before I was supposed to go through the Military Entry Processing Center, or what is called MEPS, down in Tampa. And so I was able to kind of go through without having needing a waiver. And so that's pretty much about me in a nutshell, besides going in depth into the different schools and trainings that I went through with the military.
Hey, so yeah, we are having this conversation on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And even though this is not the anniversary of 9/11 isn't necessarily the centerpiece of what we're going to be talking about today, but because you did mention you were in basic training when the terror attacks did happen, when you think back, reflect back 20 years ago, what were some of the emotions at that time? Or if you had to sum it up perhaps in one word or something along those lines, how would you describe looking back 20 years ago to this day?
This day, I think for many people, regardless if you're in the military or not, or in some type of first responder occupation, is one that is cemented in your mind. I think because of the amount of shock and trauma for many. And I think the same applied for me and my fellow basic trainees. I remember very vividly, we were getting ready to go into our training phase. In basic training, you go through different phases, which is corresponds to the colors of the flags, the red, white, and blue phases. And so we were going to our training phase to prepare us for our soldier skills and to ensure that we understood how to do basic rifle marksmanship and combat training in duress. And so we were getting ready to go to our field exercise and ZEAL at the time at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And I remember we were getting ready to load the military vehicles in order to head out to the field and to set up our tents and do all these things. And so I remember thinking, oh, okay, here's another day. Yeah, get ready, make sure my body's ready for ruck marching, make sure I'm hydrated. We're awake, everything's packed. So all these details are running through your mind, making sure that you don't do anything to upset the drill sergeants or get their attention. And then as we're waiting, I sensed nervousness and a bit of anxiety in the air. The drill sergeants were looking at us nervously and whispering to each other back and forth. And we're like, so the trainees are like, what's going on? Like, we haven't left. And they're pretty strict about gotta get out, you know, make sure we're on time. And so the Army has this joke where it's hurry up and wait. And so they finally told us to leave our things, to ground it, as it's called. So we were marched into our training classrooms, which have small TVs that are set up. And we were told to sit down. We were not told the details of what happened. We were just told that you all really need to watch the news. And so they turned the TV on. And I remember thinking my stomach was turning because I was like, I feel something's bad happened, but I just don't know what it is. I just know if they're that uncomfortable and they're supposed to be our leadership, and these are, you know, people who are trained to undergo duress and stress and know how to handle it. And if they're nervous, I have a lot to be nervous about. Then I turned the TV on to one of the news stations, and I'm not sure which one. And I remember the newscasters obviously were speaking in rapid tone, which illustrates how anxious and how chaotic that time frame was. And so they're saying the towers were hit. And then all of a sudden, as we were watching, the second plane came and hit one of the Twin Towers. All the trainees' faces were in shock. Majority of them were in shock. And I was just looking around trying to pick up if there are any cues as to what just happened. What did I just see and why was it happening? What did that mean for me and for the trainees and for this country? Until one of our male drill sergeants sat us down. And then he commenced to tell us that the Twin Towers were hit. He said, we can't guarantee that the country's going to be at war, but just understand that it means that sometime in the future we could be. And you guys are right now in basic training, and you all may be entering an army that's going to be at war. And we were flabbergasted because we were the generation of be all you can be in the Army, a generation where the Army's marketing was about college scholarships and opportunity to save money for college and have skill sets. And some did enlist in the Army for altruistic reasons of service to nation and country, military legacy of family service in the armed forces. And so that day cemented in my mind the amount of commitment that I was making to the Army and to the country. And that when I signed that contract, what did that really mean? Regardless of the reasons why I came in and why I joined, from this day forward, you've signed to serve the nation and to do it in a capacity that could mean losing your life or losing limbs or losing faculties. And I remember I reached out to God and I said, Lord, this is not the reason why I joined. However, I said, I know that you're a God that honors oath, honors commitment. And I want to make sure that I honor my commitment. Whether I knew it or not, I signed. Whether my parents knew it or not, we all signed. And so I want to make commitment today that I'm committed to doing what I need to do and for what the country has asked me to do, because I committed and I signed. And then so I had to accept that. And I think that day I accepted what it meant to be a servant leader, what it meant to be in service to nation, and the gravity of that decision at the young age of 18 and saying, okay, Lord, this is it then. I'm not going to go back on my word. I already signed the contract. I'm not going to even ask to be taken out of that contract. I'm just going to push through, and whatever happens, whatever happens, it's in your hands, and you lead and guide me. And if I perish, then it is what it is at this point. And I just had to accept that that's some of the consequences of service to nation. There were a lot of my peers and there were trainees who were like, I didn't sign up for this. I'm getting out. I have to get out. I didn't belittle what they said because it raced through my mind, right? I considered it. And so we were in an army that was pretty much had not been in any type of combat engagement for quite a while. We had a presence in other countries, but we did not have any combat engagement for quite some time. And so the complacency and the idea that the army would stay outside of combat was very naive. And I was someone who always struggled with being anxious and struggled with fear. And I just was very resolute at that moment that, Liliane, you need to be focused. You need to take this training seriously. You need to look to your left and to your right and to support those who are your battle buddies to make sure that you guys all get through this for those who want to stay to the best of your ability. And so my drill sergeant always said, well, you're such a serious young recruit, but yeah, 9/11 occurred. I could potentially, at any time, I felt, be asked to go into combat, and I wanted to be ready. Even though I was young, I no longer wanted to be naive. I wanted to do the best that I could with what the resources the Army had in order to be the best recruit that I could be, to be prepared so that way no one would say that I was not ready for combat, or they had to focus on me and not on their own task because I wasn't ready. And so I just stayed focused and studied hard, exercised a lot because I needed to, because I was struggled in basic training with physical fitness and everything else. But I kept pushing myself, and I paid attention to everything that my leadership would tell me. I just would write it down, make sure that I understood what they were asking me to do. And it really made me a much better recruit because there was no time to play around. There were no more games, at least for me. And so that's what 9/11's impact had on me as a very, very early recruit.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Those are some interesting perspectives, interesting points that you bring, particularly with regards to service and sort of the new perspective that it gave you on what service and commitment means. And you're right. At that point, we had been 10 years, we'll say, 10 years or so, removed from the first Gulf War. And so, yeah, something I had never thought about is that largely the 1990s were what you might consider peacetime marketing for the military. And then 9/11 happens, and that completely changes that outlook for a lot of people. Okay, so you mentioned that you're currently a major in the U.S. Army. So tell me about that. How did you go then from the path, or what was your path from enlisted to serving as an officer?
After I finished basic training, I was a medical service corps soldier. And so my actual military occupation specialty at MOS was preventive medicine, which is essentially an occupation that deals with any disease or non-battle injuries that can result in a soldier becoming a casualty or combat ineffective. So we had to educate soldiers on any type of illness that can prevent them from being able to be deployed. And so I went to, after advanced individual training at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, I went to Fort Drum, New York, where it was my first duty assignment. And I will say, because of the seriousness that I took after 9/11, my drill sergeants took notice, and God really granted me favor every step of the way. All my drill sergeants were interested in helping me because they knew that I took whatever they said seriously. And I was not a problem soldier. And so by the time I arrived at Fort Drum, I think it was Guthrie Medical Clinic, and I was assigned to preventive medicine section there, where I was under the leadership of Captain Miette. And then there's a specialist there. She was promotable specialist at the time, Shelly Simpson. And she's starting first class now. So she's doing very well. And so they were the ones that were in charge of developing me and were my leadership at the time. And it was a great environment for me as a medical soldier. They really grew me. And I think it was the conditions of having a post-Gulf War Army, just really great NCOs experience. This was a time that to be a sergeant first class or senior enlisted soldier that you had been in the Army for at least 15 plus years. And so you really knew your craft, you knew your specialty, and you were pretty much the subject matter expert in your field, especially in developing soldiers. And so Fort Drum developed me well as a soldier, even though I was only there for about a year and a half. They developed me well as a soldier. I mean, just really grew me and made sure that I did well. And again, I truly think it was a favor of God where people just wanted to help me. And I know it's the Army itself too, and the great NCOs that I had, but I'm just so grateful that I was just in a really good organization. And so I had a really great leader. He was the chief of preventive medicine at Guthrie. And I think he came in and they asked me to write an article because we didn't have that many people in my section. Plus, I was excited because I enjoyed writing. Even since I was a young child, I enjoyed reading and writing. And those are some of my strong suits. And so I was like, that's going to be easy for me. And so I remember writing the article and trying to make it as interesting as possible and adding creativity to it. And, and that was great that no one stifled that creativity. And so I presented it to my leadership and Colonel Brewster was like, Delva, that was a great job. You did an amazing job in the article. And then so he was like, I need you to come see in my office for a little bit. I said, okay, sir, no problem. So I made sure my leadership, Special Simpson and Captain Miette knew. And so I went to Colonel Brewster's office, nervous because, of course, being asked to go to a senior officer's office is not the best. You always think that you're in trouble. And so I remember sitting stiffly in my seat and he said, you wrote a really great article. At the time I was PFC Delva. He said, you wrote a really great article. And he said, I just want to ask you some questions. He said, I have a daughter right now that's currently at West Point. He said, have you ever heard of West Point? I said, well, when I was in AIT, I said, one of the soldiers was talking about West Point. I said, but I really don't know what that is. And he said, well, it's a military academy, like it's like a college that you can go to. And he said, and she's there, it's her first year. I think it was her first year there. And he said, they have recruiters that come up to Fort Drum. He said, I think you'll be a great candidate for West Point. I said, okay, sir. And he said, I think you should go to one of their recruiting sessions and just listen in and see what they say. He said, I'll let you have half a day off so you can go to that session. I was just like, well, okay. I'm really just trying to finish my commitment in the Army. I'm really not trying to do anything extra. My goal was to go to University of Florida. It was always my dream to go to University of Florida and to be a Gator. And so I was not really interested in going to West Point. But I said, I'll listen. So I apply and I get into the prep school. And I was shocked. Then I get into West Point Prep School and everyone was so excited. And I was excited. I was like, I couldn't believe that I got in. That's great. That's great. W, you're going right. And I was like, yeah. And I was like, well, it's only 1 year. I said, if I don't like it, I can just leave. And that way my commitment in the Army will be 1 year less. Just it'll work out for me. I'll go to the prep school and I'll leave and I won't stay. And then I get to the prep school. And so that's how I ended up, going into the West Point prep. I decided to stay at West Point because I made it through the prep school, made some really good friends. And so they told me that the first 2 years at West Point are essentially free with no commitment. So I said, well, I'll do that. I said, let me see how it is. And so that's how my Army career ended up taking flight, was really just because I was curious and I wanted to know, well, let me just see what it's like. If it's for me, then, I'll stay in. I said, but there's no commitment. There's no wait. I said, so I will stay the first 2 years. But there was a time that I wanted to leave. And this happens to a lot of cadets. And after teaching at West Point, I was able to see it in many different cadets from socioeconomic backgrounds enduring something similar. And it's the idea that when you leave high school, like I said, I had a 3.8 GPA and I did well in the Honor Society and had all these accolades, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Florida education is the same as Texas education is the same as New York education standards. And so coming to West Point, I realized that I was not as well prepared as I thought I was. And so it was overwhelming to start out at a deficit. And so you're having to study even harder, longer, and you feel like you're a failure. You feel like Obviously, I was not as smart as I thought I was. All these other kids they're amazing. I mean, West Point has so many amazing young people. These are natural, some of them natural leaders, some of them leaders who through experience have gained the ability to lead people very well. And so now you're being compared to that caliber of student. And it's intimidating, very, very intimidating. And for me, I still had, I came from a background where English is not my first language. Haitian Creole was my first language for up until I was 5. I'd gone to Haitian Creole daycares. I know Florida had Head Start program that I was a part of, but even then, because it was Florida and there's a lot of diaspora communities, you could still have people within those programs that can speak your native language or your home language, I have to say for myself. And so it didn't feel like it was destabilizing to go to those places because I could communicate. But then when you're in schools were the first time that I started speaking English, good English, because you can pick up bad English very well, and to include curse words, which is usually one of the first things immigrant children or first generation children learn, are the curse words that are being yelled at them sometimes by other people. And so it was in that environment that, I learned English, and it took me a while to learn. And so I finally was able to finish ESL, but I still had a heavy accent. And so that accent was like the bane of my existence. And so I remember as a young child always trying to get rid of it because it drew so much attention from other children that they made fun of me for it. So I remember spending countless hours in front of the TV watching Jeopardy or reading Rainbow and Sesame Street, trying to articulate well enough in order to, to cover up my accent. And so by the time I hit my second year at West Point, I was like, I don't think this is for me. I'm feeling a lot of anxiety and stress. And to be fair, some of the stress that I felt at West Point wasn't all from school. And at the same time, too, I was starting to have panic attacks and anxiety attacks at West Point from all the things I was going through. At the same time, too, the panic attacks were also stemming from unhealed trauma that I was still wrestling with, but didn't have time to deal with at West Point because it was so busy and I had so much going on. And so I was like, I just need to leave. I just need to leave. I'm tired of feeling like I'm imposter here because I'm not doing as well as I thought I would be doing. And I'm feeling that any day someone's going to find out that, Liliane is an imposter and she should not be at West Point, and it's time for her to leave. And, she was only able to get in here because she was a prior enlisted soldier. And I'm like, God, this is too much. It's too much stress. And so I was getting ready to leave. I had everything planned out. And so I remember I told my mom this great plan that my twin sister and I had. And so I was like, it's time to go. And my mom sat me down and she was like, baby, what are you doing? I said, Mom, it's too hard here. I said, I'm struggling. I said, and also too, there are people who don't like me here. They don't treat me well. To be fair, there are also really good people who did treat me well. But when you're going through stressful times, you focus on the negative. You don't always see the good people that are around you. I had really good peers and classmates and my prepster classmates that were still there and supporting me. But I just felt with everything going on that I just couldn't do it at West Point anymore. And so she said, so you're so close. She said, you already technically gone for 3 years at this point with West Point. She said, you have 2 more years left. She said, why would you give it up now? I said, Mom, once I cross over into that next year, I said, I'm obligated to Army service. I have to serve or I have to pay it all back. I have to. I said, it's better to leave now. She said, baby, there's no guarantee that what you want to do is going to work out. She said, why don't you just stay at West Point? But I was ready to leave by that point. And so she was like, just finish strong. And whatever finishing strong looks like for you, just do that. And so that's why I decided to stay in. And that's what kept me going and allowed me to become the military officer that I am now. It's my mom.
Well, that's a great story. And as you were talking, what it reminded me of is, have you ever heard of a book named Grit by Angela Duckworth?
I have heard of it. I've never read it, but I've heard of it.
And it's been years since I've read this book, so I might get some details wrong. But it goes into talking about how talent isn't always a guarantee of success. And it's more about passion and perseverance. And the reason why I bring that up is because, if I'm not mistaken, one of the first groups that she tested this, if I can call it a theory, that might not be the right word, but the first group that she tested grit out on was folks at West Point. And I forget what the percentage was, but she guessed a very high percentage was accurate. Hey, I'm going to tell you who's going to finish at West Point and who's not going to finish at West Point. And it was amazing, and people were blown away. I don't know what's happened with grit since then, how it's being used or where it's being employed or that sort of thing. But as you're talking, that was the first thing that came to my mind as you're talking about is passion and perseverance and your mom telling you to finish strong. So I want to circle back to your time at West Point in just a moment, maybe dig into that a little bit deeper. But first, tell me your testimony. How did you become a believer?
We grew up Catholic, and so my mom always believed in God. My dad believed in God. But I will say that in Haiti, you also have other religions that are competing, such as voodoo, that is pretty prevalent there. There's not as common back then, but it's common more now. Islam is present in Haiti and just other type of religions. And so there's always this idea of where people blend certain things and they become more comfortable with others in their family doing it. And it's not uncommon for that to happen where you see a blending of different belief systems. But my mom really wanted us to not be part of that. She was adamant that she didn't want us to be practitioners because there's a belief in voodoo about the power of multiple births and because of the multiple life force equates to multiple power within individuals. And so the idea that when she had twins, especially identical female twins, that there was something powerful in that. And it attracted a lot of attention from extended family members or people in Haiti who were voodoo practitioners because that is something that they have ceremonies, they have belief systems or principles that surrounding multiple births and the power that originates from those births. And so, but she never wanted us to be a part of it. And so for us, she always brought us to Catholic church, and we did our first communion in Little Haiti in a church called Notre Dame, Church of Little Haiti. And so we did all that, and we were pretty well invested in our training and different things like that. But it was not really until I became a teenager that I truly had a better understanding of God. Now, I always had a reverence because of my Catholic upbringing. I always had a reverence for God and for the apostles and different representations of leadership in the Bible. But it was not until my oldest sister, Micheline, she converted to Protestantism and she became a Baptist, that we actually started reading our Bible more and dug deep into it. And so I started reading and singing more. We became part of a church singing group and different things like that. All still part of the Haitian community. And so we sung in English because we were first generation, but we also would do songs in Haitian Creole for the older population. And I think that's really where I had a better understanding of God. And then coupled with the reverence that I already had from my Catholic upbringing and from the understanding of the history that came from the Catholic education, I was kind of able to marry that up, a blending of sorts, to really try to find out and establish a relationship with God for myself. Not one that was based upon what my mother believed or even what caused my older sister to convert, but one just for myself. And so especially too, as a young child dealing with trauma at a young age, I was always seeking out for God to help me to answer the unexplainable things in my life as to why things happen, why did it happen to me? And so I was always seeking out to reach out to God. And so there'll be plenty of times when I would sit outside and my parents were always like, oh, Liliane's having they would think I was sunbathing, but really I was outside trying to to try to make a connection to be like, and to really talk to God. And then so in those moments, I believe that I became a believer, not necessarily through a church, but the church upbringing and education helped. But it's really in me reaching out and being open and saying, God, I need you. Like, I want you to be a part of my life because I need you to answer these questions. And I honestly think if it wasn't for the trauma that I had as a young child, I wouldn't have determined to find out and to seek God out in the way that I did, because I just really needed answers. And I really needed comfort because at a young age, I think it was between the ages of 2 and 3, there was a young yard worker that came in. And at the time, because of my parents' young immigrant family, they had to, my dad worked at night and my mom worked in the morning. And so we were babysat in between by, personnel that were in the Haitian community because we lived in Little Haiti back then. And so there was a young yard worker that came. I remember my first memories are of tall grass and running through it with diapers and just enjoying life. And I think there was a moment where that he was able to take me somewhere and then he physically violated me. And so I remember feeling just so violated at a young age, but I think my parents were trying to protect me by not speaking of it because they didn't want me to have any type of traumatic experiences. And just being very young parents, not realizing that the child still knows. They just, because the family doesn't talk about it, they stop talking about it. But I still knew that something happened to me. I just kind of blocked it out because it wasn't being spoken about in the house. And so my parents thought because at a young age, I would just forget about it. But trauma, if it's strong enough, will be imprinted on the child, becomes one of your first memories. And so they didn't talk about it, but I knew it existed in me. And so I just remember needing someone to talk to, and I would talk to God about things that I struggled with, and due to not having untreated trauma, dealing with certain thought processes, dealing with what I would call my sad periods or episodes, which is really depressive states at a young age, but not understanding how that was caused and why that was caused, but just knew that I was feeling those things and really being outside in the sun because it helped to ground me and helped me to feel that, okay, I can feel the environment. And so it's like you're present. So I would stop disassociating because I would disassociate a lot in the sense of daydreaming as a way to escape. My dad now tells me that, we went through a court case and it went to the police at the time. They did a police report on the young man. He was arrested. And I went through trial. They put me on the stand at a very young age. I don't even know. I'm sure they had to get an interpreter because I didn't speak very well. I mean, my English wasn't that great because I still was speaking Creole all the time. And then having to undergo physical exams at a very young age. And just, of course, understanding now, as growing up, why I would, block all that out. Because it was a difficult time for my dad, having to take me to court cases, barely speaking English himself, and having to try to navigate a court system where, your child is violated and you feel like you don't have a voice, and that voice has to be interpreted and you're not quite sure what people are saying and how is it coming across, and is it enough to have someone go to jail? And so there was just so much that was going on during that time that I think later on, the young man, the case was dropped. Later on, I'm not sure why, but I think the case was dropped, and then I don't think the young man ended up going to jail. But I just knew that it caused a lot of issues for my dad, and our bond grew as father and daughter. He became like my hero because he kind of was a person that rescued me from the man. I was able to, when I went and I told him, what happened, he believed me right away and addressed it. And so for a young child to know that, when you tell your parents something and that's traumatic that happened to you and they go and they believe you, it matters a lot. You have no idea that at a young age, young children remember that you believed them and that you acted on what they said. And so I still remember that to this day, that my dad always remembered, always believed what I said, and he acted upon that belief, reporting it and, taking the man all the way to trial because he believed me. And he knew that I was telling him these things, and he didn't brush it off. And so that's why my relationship with God became so rooted, was through trauma, honestly. And I became a believer because I so desperately needed to know that, I needed to know that there was a God in the universe that heard me.
Yeah, there's so many things running through my mind as you're telling your story. First of all, wow, I'm really sorry to hear that you had to experience that trauma at such a young age, and I appreciate your willingness to share that part of your story. One of the things that crossed my mind as you were sharing this is what you said about your dad, your earthly father, and how he responded and how he was your hero and that sort of thing. I wonder, do you think that had an impact then on how comfortable you were and what you thought about your heavenly father?
Absolutely. And there's so many people that have discussed this connection between how we view the word father. And so for me, because I had such a positive view of fatherhood and the role and the authority figure of a father, not one that was punitive, not one that was harsh in nature, but one that was loving, embraced me, cared for me, protected me, sheltered me, that I saw the same attributes in my heavenly father that I saw in my earthly father. Absolutely. And I think that as Christians, that's something that we need to be mindful of. The stumbling blocks for people to accept and how they see God is because they may not have a good view of their father, or what father represents to them may not be in a positive light. And that's why I thank God for me that mine was positive enough that I was willing to reach out to God because I felt that how I saw him was always in a way that was loving and comforting. And even the imagery that I see when I envision God is one that he's sheltering and holding me and caring for me. And it's never one that is harsh. And I can balance, I can have a good balance of God in the sense that God is also authority figure, in the sense that, obedience is important and there are consequences to our actions when we disobey, in the same way that when I disobey my earthly father, that I would get punished. But the punishment was always done in love. And I could see it because I always saw him as a representation of love and I didn't see his punishment as something that was done to hurt me, but really was there to help me and to ensure that he curbed negative behaviors and to keep me from certain end states. And so you're absolutely right that the way that we envision the word father and the image that we see regarding father or dad is very important because it can influence the way that we see God. At a young age, that term is rooted in us from the relationship that we have from our earthly fathers. And if it's not healthy, it could influence the relationship we have with God.
Yeah, and the relationship part is key. And that was the other thing that I'd noticed as you were sharing your story, as you were talking about this reverence that you had. And of course, there are other denominations that maybe focus more on ritual. Those two things are important in the life of a believer, but also it's that third R, relationship, that sometimes gets so overlooked. And it is understanding and finding that balance among those three of reverence, ritual, and relationship that are very much key. I want to go back to the trauma, and you said that you had prayed to God and God was the person that you talked to and shared your thoughts and your heart with and that sort of thing. What sort of healing have you experienced from that trauma?
So for me, I'm one of those people, I didn't get to start my healing journey really until I was in my late 20s and well into my Army career, just because I continued to block it out. I kept myself very busy, and that's also a coping mechanism that people who are going through trauma will do. You keep yourself so busy mentally, physically, to the point that you just don't deal with your issues. But I got to a point where I just kept sensing that God is like, you need to deal with this. And I was like, God, I'm not ready. Even when I was at West Point, and that's why I was mentioning my first 2 years, I could sense that because after a while, your memories start to kind of leak back out. They don't, I mean, you can block them out, but there are times they get triggered and they leak back out. And so that's the reason I was having panic attacks at West Point, was because I was having dreams and I kept seeing things that were appearing in my dreams come up and they were causing me issues and I couldn't sleep. And I would have issues with breathing during that time. And so God was like, you have to deal with this because it's going to affect how you interact with people. And to a certain extent, it did, because I could never really have a close relationship with people outside of my family. And so I just felt that the Holy Spirit was speaking to me and said, Liliane, you have to deal with this. What we don't realize as believers is that the anxiety and the issues that stems from trauma interferes with your ability to truly be free as God wants you to be free. Because out of fear, you won't do certain things. And that fear stems from your trauma. Out of anxiety, you won't interact with certain people, or you'll stay in your own home because, of your trauma. And so if God is asking me to go out and interact with people and I have a social anxiety, then I can't do what it is that God has called me to do, not to the full extent of what he's asking me to do. And so I had to realize that in order to get to the next level of my relationship with God, which is, truly going forth and either ministering to people or evangelizing, speaking the truth of the gospel, I needed to get rid of the trauma. I couldn't do those things with it holding me back. And so I was stationed in Korea at the time, in South Korea, excuse me. And I remember I went up to a chaplain, and it just kept bothering me. And I kept having sleepless nights. I said, God, not now, not now. Please, God, I can't. And I told the Holy Spirit, I said, Liliane, you got to. You have got to face your fears. You got to deal with it. So you're not 3 years old anymore. You're an adult now. You have to face it as an adult and not as a child. And so I went up to the chaplain and I said, Chaplain, and I remember I invited him to my office because I needed some privacy. There's a chaplain, and I remember crying through it and tears running down my face. As a captain of the United States Army, and I'm just like, And I feel like I'm, again, a young child. And I said, Chaplain, do you deal with people who have trauma, with sexual trauma? And then he was like, and he looked at me, he said, I don't have experience in that, but he said, but I know someone who does. And he said, I'll connect them to you. And he said, I'm sorry that you're going through that. He said, but I'm proud that you're brave enough to deal with it. And I remember thinking to myself, I was crying and thinking to myself that I don't feel brave right now, but I just know that I need to do it because God is telling me I got to do it. And this is where, as Christians, we face that test of faith that I don't know what's going to happen. I feel that if I uncover all these blocks or unblock these memories, that something bad may happen. I may result into depressive state, which I don't want to go back into. I mean, I'm fearful of that. But as believers, we get to that precipice of where, obedience versus our own comfort level. Or you have to face it. And there are times when we are testing our faith that you're not going to be comfortable. Honestly, I think it's not meant to be comfortable because you are stepping outside of your comfort zone. In order to truly test your faith, you have to. And so I was like, God, this is truly going to be a test of my faith, because I sensed that I had a fear of reverting back to a destructive point in my life where I didn't want to exist in life anymore. And I didn't want to go back to that. And I feared that I would go back to that if I hit a depressive state low enough that I no longer wanted to exist. And so I was like, God, I need, if I do this, I said, Lord, you're gonna have to be with me every step of the way, because I won't be able to do it. I said, I have no family members here. So I started there, just removing certain things out of my life activities. And I read my Bible more. And the time that I used to designate to those activities, I started dedicating more to prayer and reading my Bible. And then later on, it went into doing the Daniel fast. And so I did what's considered a partial fast. I removed certain things from my diet in order to make sure that my physical nature was weakened, so that my spiritual nature was strengthened, so I could get through counseling. As you're going through counseling, you're facing some of your greatest fears, even having nightmares from these things. And so having to face it with at this time, a stranger, even though he was a counselor at the time, it was still hard. And having to trust that he would be able to lead me out in a way that would leave me in a better state than when I came in. And because they have certain techniques during counseling that they can utilize in order to have you imagine that you're leaving all your memories and all these hurts and pains in a specific place, so that way you don't carry that burden with you. And so for me, I called the closet, because the closet when I was younger was where things happened that were kind of hidden away from people, and I had another situation where I had, sexual molestation from someone that I knew, and it happened in a closet. And so for me, closet was everything that's hidden, that's bad and dirty, it stays in that space, and I won't take it with me. I can just kind of leave it there. And so that was like the word choice that we used. And we use a procedure called, and I don't know what the acronym means, but it's called EMDR. It's a process where you use light and sound as a way to kind of tap into blocked memory channels in the brain. And so we had to use that because mine had been blocked for a very, very long time. And I didn't remember half of what happened when I was a child. And so they had to kind of tap into the recesses of my mind in order to figure out what happened. And so, but as you open up those blocked passageways, you feel everything as though when you're a child. You feel the sensations and the discomfort, the pressure. And so I was like, oh, this is why I don't want to do this. Yeah, I remember now. This is why I don't want to do this. Goodness. And so, my body is now reacting to it, and there's tension in my body. My stomach is clenching. I'm nauseous. I want to throw up, and I'm having to speak through all that and to push through it, because that's the path to healing. You have to face it and press through it in order to overcome. And so when we think about the idea of when the Bible says, I'm more than a conqueror, in order to conquer something, you have to overcome it. You have to push through it to overcome it. And so I had to force myself to go back and say, Liliane, you have to go back. As much as you don't want to go back, and afterwards you can't eat. I had to take days off of work just to make it through the day, because I couldn't engage with people after my counseling sessions. And I remember it made my boss really upset at work. And to be fair, I didn't tell him that I was going through counseling. And at the time I had a boss, he was going through so much, he honestly didn't care. And so I told the Lord, I have to sacrifice, what I desire for my career, because I have to place me first. I said, even though I know I'm going to get a negative evaluation at this time, I don't trust my boss enough to tell him what I'm going through. I'm just going to have to deal with it and sacrifice, this evaluation in my Army career because I need to take care of me. Because I couldn't even function at work because my boss was triggering me to the point that I was having issues performing at work because he was kind of hostile and he was a pretty toxic leader. And so I couldn't function with him and go through trauma at the same time. Through my trauma process at the same time. I just couldn't do it. And so I just wouldn't go to work. I would say, I would have an appointment and I'm going to stay, I'm going to work from home or I'm just going to clock out from work early at that time. And he didn't like it, but I just had to accept that it would be what it'll be. Because I honestly couldn't perform after coming on those counseling sessions. I couldn't even eat. And because of the anxiety, it would put my stomach into knots. And it would take several hours before I could really eat afterward, after every session. And so you have to make yourself go back, convince yourself again that this is the best thing for you, even though it doesn't feel like it at all. It doesn't feel like it at all. And I think that's what some people don't understand when people are going through therapy for trauma, that you have to make yourself go back. And it feels like you're beating yourself up for no reason when you could go back to what is comfortable, which is blocking the memories and just going through another decade of acting as though nothing happened to you, even though you get triggered and you remember that something did happen. And so the trauma journey was a difficult one, but over time it became a little easier, especially as after every session you realize that there's a piece of the weight that is now gone. You really are leaving it behind and it becomes more manageable, but you have to go through several sessions before you get there, and then you build that trust relationship with your therapist that you're like, okay, I trust him enough to say, yes, I can leave this with him. My therapist was a military chaplain that had experience in trauma. He had taken courses. I think he was a family life chaplain, but he had taken he'd done training in trauma that he was able to help me. And so we did sessions for quite a bit, but then he had to leave, and that was hard to build a relationship with someone, to build that trust. And then he had to leave. And I remember thinking, and to have interrupting the healing process is not good either, because it can be destabilizing. And I had to kind of figure out what to kind of do with myself after that, because no one else had that kind of training in Korea. And so I noticed that I started having physical manifestations of my trauma and anxiety. My health I wasn't doing very well. I had to ask God, okay, what is next? How do I deal with this? And so I just kept trying to do as much as possible in terms of making myself go through therapy, having to start all over with another therapist, being moved again. Every time you move to go to another therapist. And so it wasn't easy. And to be honest, I would say that the healing process it's never complete, because there'll be something that reminds you or triggers you of your past. But I'm no longer that 2 or 3 year old that's anymore. I don't feel that I'm that 2 or 3 year old. Now I realize that I'm an adult and I manage my responses as an adult, which is critical because it shows the amount of healing that you've undergone. And so it does show me that I have gone through a lot of healing. When you can look at your situation from the perspective of an adult that has agency, that has the ability to control their response and to put your situation in perspective, than rather from the perspective of a 2 or 3 year old that feels like, adults are in charge and I have no agency over my body.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And bring that up only because my father-in-law is a Christian counselor, and EMDR, I believe, is one of his specialties as well. So when you said that, I'm like, oh, yeah, I know that. I don't know enough about it, but I know the terminology. As we've been chatting and as you've been sharing your story, several words have come to mind that you've talked about: fear, of course, and anxiety being words that really are evident in your life or have been evident throughout your life. One of the other words, though, is perseverance. We've both tossed that word around either directly or indirectly in how you've described yourself in certain situations. So let me ask, what role do you think perseverance has played in your life?
It's played an amazing role ever since from the time that I joined the Army. Well, at the time really of being a young person and kind of pressing through and trying to deal with my own emotions and trying to manage, just the life experiences that I was dealt. I think perseverance was critical in me overcoming obstacles, overcoming issues that I faced. And I remember when I was at West Point, not West Point, it was a prep school. And I remember thinking every time that I went through something, I would always tell myself to push through. I would have to speak to myself and say, Liliane, push through, push through. And I remember thinking that it's so critical for me that I always have to speak to myself. And we always think that, we don't realize the power of our words and the power of words to really uplift us. And so I remember there was this scripture from James 1 that really was the scripture that grounded me and propelled me to do well at West Point and really at the prep school to finish it. And I remember it's James 1, starting from verse 2, says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience." And it talks about the idea that, we get taught, and it goes later on to verse 6 until verse 7, talking about us being tossed to and fro, but we have to be able to remain firm and grounded in God. And the idea that perseverance builds our faith, allows us to have endurance and long suffering, as we continue this Christian walk. And without it, and having a drive to press through, right? When Paul says, I press toward the mark of the high calling, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. When he says that, you have to understand to press through something, there's an obstacle that is intentionally blocking you from obtaining the end state, which is that higher calling. And in order to get there, you have to push past that which you believe to have been impenetrable or insurmountable. And that's faith saying that you can do it. You can press through it and you can push through it. And so you have to, with the reliance that you have on God, to press through it. And when you're pressing through something, it's not comfortable, right? Because you're being squeezed from different sides, pressed into. And so it's a very uncomfortable process, but you don't realize how great and beneficial it is until you make it to the other side. And when you've accomplished that end state. And so perseverance is critical in our Christian walk, but also through the trauma journey, because you have to press through your past, press through your fears, press through the anxiety in order to obtain a better version of yourself, right? And that the whole time that God, as this great potter, is shaping and molding you and providing you the obstacles really that you need to make this new version of yourself, right? The old man is cast away and the new you is now being made and set forth. And that's what God is really did for me. Okay, Liliane, you have to go through this. You have to go through a trauma journey, okay, or a trauma healing journey. But there are obstacles placed in my way, the West Point, difficulties in my Army, dealing with a toxic boss. And I had to do all that while I was undergoing my trauma healing. And so it shows you that as you're being developed, things in your life don't go away. And so with perseverance, you have to press through despite what you see, despite what you feel, despite your fear, despite the pain, despite the anxiety. You have to press past through all that in order to get to this new version of yourself, but knowing that God is with you the whole time. That's what kind of gets you through. And that's what perseverance has meant to me through this journey of healing, and even through my military career. You have to press through.
Yeah, that is so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. If listeners were going to take away only one thing from your story that you've shared with us today, Liliane, what would you hope that it would be?
If we're not careful and if we let our emotions run rampant, we will only see our situations from a negative perspective, and we'll miss out on the amazing blessings and people that God has placed in our path that are helping us, that are helping to mold, to shape us into this new creature that God is developing for his kingdom. And so that's the only thing I wanted to harken back to, because I wanted people to know that negative situations will always come up in our lives. It's the nature of living in a fallen world where there'll always be bad things, but it doesn't discount the many good things, whether small or big, that God is doing, the many great people that he's placed in our path. And if we take a moment to not focus on the negative and to take a minute to step back and say, God, I thank you. Even for the small things, we realize that he really is in everything that we do. And he really is present in every aspect of our lives. And then that spirit of thankfulness allows us to push back the state of depression that people fall into. It pushes back bitterness, ungratefulness. And when we have that spirit of thanksgiving to God and joy that James 1 mentions, it gives us a different perspective and allows us to think of our situation the same way that Christ thought about it. What is the end goal of all this? And so we don't focus on the now. We focus on, okay, God, where are you taking me next? There is a greater strength in you than you realize that allows you to overcome. And that's a strength that you find in God.
OCF Crosspoint is a production of Officers Christian Fellowship. For more information about OCF, check us out online at ocfusa.org or find us on Facebook and Instagram at OCFUSA. This episode was hosted and produced by me, Josh Jackson. Audio cleanup and repair was done by Michael Jerry of Mighty Productions. If you have an idea for a guest, topic, or story that you think should be considered on a future episode, send an email to podcast@ocfusa.org. Thanks for listening, and be sure to join us for the next episode of OCF Crosspoint.